Welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I am your host, Nick de la Torre, and welcome now to The Next Right Thing with Debbie and Adam. Welcome, Debbie and Adam.
Oh, thank you so much, Nick. We love this day, the feast day of St. Padre Pio. As a matter of fact, Adam, I'm going to be dedicating the whole show for Take Two with Jerry and Debbie all about Padre Pio. So we get to start it early this morning with our Morning Joy listeners, our joyful pilgrim warriors who are walking with us. How exciting it is to have this beautiful feast day. As you can tell, there's just an excitement in my voice. And I know Nick mentioned that we're going to talk about the Stigmata. We're also going to talk about a very interesting story that happened with you, Adam, in the area of the work that you do. So why don't you begin, and I'll happily, and I mean happily, jump in.
Okay, so one of the things I think some people already know, we do our exorcisms every Friday here in a place that has a lot of relics in it. And so I'm around relics every week, and we also receive relics from around the world as different places close, and they may have, these left over and they don't know what to do with them. And so they'll arrive here and there over the years. In addition, sometimes I'll have priest friends who a relic will come into their possession and it doesn't have papers. And in this case, it wasn't even mounted in what's called a teca, that little container that holds the relic, with the glass window. And they didn't know if it was real or not. Now, when something isn't even mounted, honestly, unless you had absolute provenance of where it came from, you can't say that it's real for sure. You can't use it publicly and say, this is definitely a relic of Padre Pio. But in this case, a priest friend had received a single little white hair that supposedly was from Padre Pio's glove. And apparently those woolly gloves that you see him wearing, because he wore them for years, would have picked up a few of his hairs. I know that sounds very specific and a little strange, but, that's what happens. We sometimes lose our hairs. So he had received this, and he had it in a little plastic bag, like a sandwich baggie. Mm-hmm. So you couldn't even see it unless you, held it up to a light and looked really hard and, oh, yeah, there it is. So sometimes people will give these to me and ask me to kind of informally test them during the exorcisms, because one of the signs of possession is a reaction to the holy.
Right.
Particularly when it's not obvious. If you hold a crucifix over somebody and, start speaking Latin, it's obvious you're supposed to react if you're faking. But a reaction to the holy, even when they're in the human state, when the demon hasn't taken over, is one of the signs of possession. So there was a man there that we'd been praying with for a while. We already were sure that he was possessed. The exorcisms were approved. And, very nice guy. So before the session started, we always chat a minute and see how the person's doing, how their week went, and did anything change? Do you need to go to confession before we start? And do you want to talk about anything? And so while we're chatting, I said, if it's okay with you, would you hold this bag and tell me if you feel anything? And he said, sure. And he's sitting in a chair across from me. We're just kind of there in the church. And he takes the bag and immediately doubles over in pain and grabs his forehead and kind of moans and says, it feels like my head is splitting apart. It hurts. And he's holding the bag in his other hand. And he's kind of struggling, to continue to hold the bag, and he's doubled over. And I said, okay, so-and-so, can you tell me, do you have any sense of why you're feeling this or what's in this bag? And he's kind of, thinking or something. He's kind of got his eyes closed and he's just holding his forehead. And I said, well, do you have a sense of whether, this is related to a person? And he nods his head. And I said, do you feel that this is related to a man or a woman? And he said, a man. And I said, do you think this is related to a young man? And he's like, no, there's an old man. He has white hair. He's got a beard. And I said, okay, do you see, or have a sense of what they might be wearing. Are they wearing plain clothes? Are they wearing a suit? And he's like, no, no, no. They're wearing like a robe. I said, do you mean it's like what a monk would wear? And he's like, yeah. Is it black? No, it's brown. And so on and on. And he basically described through yes and no, Padre Pio. And I had him hand it back to me, and within 10 or 15 seconds the pain stopped, and he sat back up and was able to open his eyes, and he's like, what was that? And I said, well, a priest friend was told this was a hair from Padre Pio's glove, and he's like, I saw him, I could see him in my mind. So during the sessions, sometimes the person's sitting in a chair and maybe Father's in front of them, so and I'm behind, they're facing away from me. And, I'm there to assist. So mainly if the demon animating the body gets violent and lunges at Father or tries to get out of the chair or attacks us, it's my job to gently restrain them so they don't hurt themselves or somebody else. So I'm right there. And I will sometimes hold relics on their head during the session, pick up a different relic depending on the spirit we're dealing with. And during that day, I picked up that bag and would hold that on their head. They can't see what I'm doing or what I'm picking up. But again, there was this reaction, even though, so a reaction just like the other first-class relics. And first-class relics, for those who don't know, are an actual part from that saint, like maybe a piece of their bone or a piece of their hair. Second class is something they owned, like Padre Pio's gloves. Third class is something that's been touched to a first or second class. So yeah, Padre Pio, there's so much to say about him. We could get into the idea of stigmata, his specific story. I know he's one of your favorite saints, Deb, so you probably have a ton you want to share about him.
Well, yeah, and I thank goodness I get the whole hour on take two, so that's fantastic. But for this particular portion for Morning Joy, I think that was an amazing story that you just shared. And I'd like you to also go into, you're the author of the book Catholic Guide for Miracles, right? And you talk about stigmata in that book. And I'd like you to go in depth on exactly what that means to have this mystical gift, right? And we know that Padre Pio had the stigmata. He had the wounds of Christ, but he also had the head wound, and he also had the shoulder wound, which was the most painful. And he had them for about 50 years, and then they went away before he died. But the cool part of the stigmata with Padre Pio, Adam, is that the fragrance, and he constantly lost blood every single day. Every day he lost blood, and it's amazing how he even was able to do the work he did, being in the confessional for so many hours and being at Mass and constantly praying and eating tiny little bits of food, just a little bit of food, in order to keep himself going. But yet, and he was losing blood every day. So it's amazing how his whole life, when you look at the majority of his life, 50 years, was transformed into this really one big, gigantic, mystical gift, with many other gifts, right? Like the gifts of the ability to bilocate and reading souls, and he had visions, he had healings. I mean, it goes on and on. I mean, I think he was one of the, he was so gifted as a saint with all of these supernatural experiences. Because he knew how to use them wisely for those that were around him or contacted him, or for people to try and get closer to God. So he was constantly pushing people to make sure they were at peace, but also to go deeper and deeper with the Lord in an honest way with confession. And he has a recipe. He had a recipe on how to really conduct your spiritual life. And I want to share that on the other side of the break. But Adam, I really want you to get in the stigmata. But so I have to ask you this question: where is that baggie with the hair of Padre Pio? Do you have it in your possession, or is it still used, or is it somewhere in a bigger reliquary?
Well, I returned it to the priest who had received that as a gift, and we can't formally authenticate it, so it's just kept
Gotcha.
privately.
Gotcha.
But that priest has a collection of relics, and so that's now among those.
Beautiful. Amazing. So did you develop a closer relationship to Padre Pio through that?
Yes, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of relics of Padre Pio, but that doesn't matter. You can still invoke him and ask for his prayers, and that always seems to be helpful during the sessions. I've been to the kind of National Shrine of Padre Pio in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is a neat place if anybody here in the States wants to go visit that. And they have one of his gloves that they kind of carry around usually. Not, I can't guarantee it, but they carry it around. It's between two pieces of plexiglass to protect it.
Right.
And they'll let you kind of hold that as they pray with you, which is very, very cool. And they have like a recreation of his cell, some of his clothing with the bloodstains on it, a number of interesting things.
Amazing. You know, he lost about 2 cups of blood a day. I mean, that is a lot to lose. And you know, and it's very interesting what he endured, especially with finding out at the end of his life when he shared that the shoulder wound was the most painful. And man, he went through a lot, thinking and spending all those hours in the confessional and then praying all day long, barely eating, you know, barely sleeping, having all of these mystical gifts, these supernatural encounters. I mean, you're talking this man was non-stop the majority of his life, you know, really connecting with the Lord and helping others grow deeper in their faith. I mean, it's pretty incredible when you think about the kind of life he led and what he endured. And he still maintained a sense of humor. He had a bit of he also even had a bit of a biting a sense of humor at times, in the sense that he could come back with some quick remarks. I mean, he had a personality, and I just love everything about Padre Pio for so many reasons. And I just I want you to continue and share with our listeners about particularly the Stigmata, because when you wrote the book, A Catholic Guide to Miracles, you did a phenomenal job describing that. And so maybe for our listeners, you can explain why this particular gift is given by God and what it means. I mean, Padre Pio was very embarrassed about the wounds. And I know that the church did a lot of investigation and, you know, tried to accuse him of all sorts of things that, you know, it was very, very hard what he went through. But he obeyed and he did what the church told him to do. But I would love for you to explain to all of us the presence of the Stigmata.
Yeah, so the Stigmata is probably the most kind of famous or talked about, or, you know, you see pictures associated with Padre Pio, because it is kind of an outward dramatic, like outward sign that you can see. But to like quickly put it in context, Stigmata and the other mystical kind of manifestations of a relationship with God, they're what are called accidental signs. And that doesn't mean whoops accident, that means secondary signs of a close relationship with God, a spiritually close, what would be called mystical, which refers to the mystery of Christ. So when these people that are later declared saints get so close to God, or are drawn so close to God, by God, really, because we can't force it, we can't make these things happen, you will see these, what are technically called accidental signs. So they're secondary, and they indicate, or they prove, in a sense, that there's a genuine closeness with God. So there's many different mystical signs. And so first, we want to put it in that context. Now, Stigmata is kind of like visible, limited kind of versions or expressions of the wounds that Christ bore. So we think, it may be that going back to Colossians 1:24 with St. Paul, this may be the first reference to a stigmata, right? So there we read, "Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am filling up what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ on behalf of his body, which is the church." of which I am a minister in accordance with God's stewardship given to me to bring to completion for you the word of God. I know that's a mouthful, but it's not completely clear, but there's another reference where Paul complains of a thorn in his side, that he's experiencing kind of wounds or pains in his body that God is allowing. Now, the first stigmatic that we hear about in the church history that we're pretty sure of because we hear about it and there's testimonies about it, is St. Francis, of course. Now, down through the church's history, there have been many, many people that have experienced these wounds. Some are fake, some are misunderstandings, and some seem to be legitimate. Now, the church generally doesn't make a ruling on and say definitively this person's wounds are, the mystical stigmata. The church will sometimes say this is not legitimate, but the church generally doesn't say this is legitimate. So they may say with a saint, there's no reason to believe this isn't real. But with stigmata, there's no absolute proof that it's real. But here's the signs of it that are typical down through history. As you mentioned in the first segment, there's a scent of flowers when the wounds are active, meaning when the wounds are actively bleeding. I've experienced that myself. I was in the room with a number of other people that experienced the scent of flowers kind of in an instant was just there and everywhere in the room. It wasn't like somebody pulled out a bottle of perfume and sprayed it and you waited and then you smelled it. It was just suddenly there. And we looked over and the wounds were bleeding. Secondly, they never get infected. They never lead to any other medical problems over the years. Third, they become active on Thursdays, and the person experiences the passion story of Christ in some way, in some mystical way, interiorly or partly exteriorly and visibly. They will experience the passion story, and the wounds will be very active during that time. And then when the story ends on Friday, the wounds generally within minutes or an hour or so will stop bleeding and close, and then they will be either scars or minimally bleeding wounds until the next Thursday. Most people don't know that part, Deb. It's not just the person's walking around with these wounds, throughout their life, and that's just it. It's actually a reliving of the Passion story every Thursday through Friday. And so there's kind of an intense period during that where the person, is visibly being afflicted. And honestly, it can be hard to watch and be supportive of the person while they're going through this. So yeah, there's a number of indicators that this is real. I can tell you anecdotally, it's interesting, people that are living with this, and I have a lot of experience with one case, it seems that because of their closeness to God, that reference to Padre Pio being able to read souls, and he knew things about people in the confessional.
Right.
From my sense of observing this, being very, very close to God in that mystical sense, I think they share a tiny bit of that awareness of almost like God's perspective on things, because they'll react to particular sin that might be going on in a house, or if a person is particularly sinful and gets near them, they can feel that. They feel like they want to get away from that person. And if a person is particularly holy or close to God, they can feel that also, and they're drawn to that. So it's kind of like there's a closeness with God is kind of the center of the stigmata.
It's so interesting you say that, because that's clearly what people that encountered Padre Pio felt, that he just knew. He knew so much of what was going on the other side of the veil.